Voyage to Liliput. Adapted from Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. At the age of 14, I was sent to college in Cambridge. After 3 years, I was apprenticed to an eminent London surgeon, Mr. James Bates, because my father could not continue to pay for my education. During the years which followed, I studied navigation, mathematics, and the use of medicines, all subjects useful to one who intended someday to travel. For a dozen years, I practiced my skill as a surgeon in my native England and on board sailing ships, making several long voyages. My leisure hours were spent reading the best authors, ancient and modern. When abroad, I liked to observe the manners of people and learn their languages. In time, I accepted an offer from Captain Pritchard, master of the Antelope, who was making a voyage to the South Sea. We set sail on May the 4th, 1699, and for the first 6 months had calm seas. Upon reaching 30 degrees south of the equator on the 5th of November, the beginning of summer in those parts, we were overtaken suddenly by a violent storm. A seaman spied a rock close to the ship, but it was too late. The wind was so strong that we were driven directly upon it, splitting the ship apart. With 5 other crewmen, I was able to lower a lifeboat and get clear of the ship and the rock. We rowed until our strength was completely spent, and then trusted ourselves to the mercy of the waves. But the seas were not kind. Soon another burst of wind upset our boat, and I found myself swimming alone in the great ocean, pushed forward by wind and tide. When able to struggle no longer and resigned to death by drowning, I found myself by some miracle at a depth where I could touch bottom. The storm was beginning to calm. I rested before pushing onward toward a distant shore. Reaching an island, I wandered another half-mile, but found no signs of human life. Eventually I lay down in the short, soft grass and slept sounder than ever before in my life. It was just daylight when I awakened. Attempting to get up, I discovered that I was on my back with my arms and legs strongly fastened to the ground. Slender cords stretched across my body, and my long, thick hair was also fastened to the ground so that I could not move my head. I heard confused sounds around me and soon felt something alive moving up my left leg, across my body, and almost up to my chin. Looking downward as much as I could, I was amazed to see a human creature not 6 inches high with a bow and arrow in his hands and a quiver on his back. At least 40 more of the same kind followed the first. I let out such a loud roar that they all ran back in fright, some leaping from my sides. But soon they were back. One walked right up to my face, lifted his hands and cried out in a shrill voice, "Hey, Kena, Dago!" Struggling to get loose, I was able to break the cords that held my left arm to the ground. With a violent and painful pull, I loosened some of the strings which held down my hair, so that I could turn my head just a little. The tiny creatures ran off a second time, and in a moment I felt the sting of more than 100 little arrows pricking my left side like so many needles. Groaning with pain, I tried again to get loose, but they shot another volley of arrows larger than the first. Some tried to stick me in the sides with their spears, but could not pierce my stiff jacket. I decided that the best thing to do was to lie still until night, when I hoped to free myself. Surely their whole army would be no match for my vastly greater size and strength. Once they saw that I was quiet, they shot no more arrows. In fact, they cut some of the strings holding my left side so that I was able to roll somewhat to my right and observe a person standing on a little stage making a speech to me. He appeared to be an official of some importance. 2 younger persons were at his sides to support him, and a young page held his robes. Of course, I understood not one syllable he said. I did not struggle in any way, but put my finger to my mouth to show that I needed food. The official got down from his stage and ordered ladders placed against my sides. 100 of the natives climbed up and walked toward my mouth with baskets of meat, which I ate 2 or 3 to a mouthful, and bread, which I took 3 loaves at a time. Then they slung up a barrel of wine, rolled it toward my hand, and beat out the top. I drank it in an instant, for it held no more than a small cup, but the taste was that of a delicious Burgundy. They brought a second barrel, but that was all they had to offer. With shouts of joy and wonder they danced upon my chest. I was tempted to seize 40 or 50 who came within reach of my hand, but did not, considering that the pain which I had felt was probably not the worst they could do. Besides, they had now shown me remarkable generosity and hospitality. I was filled with wonder that these tiny mortals could show such little fear of one who was to them a giant of fantastic size and strength. Another official marched up to my face, held a royal signet before my eyes, and pointed forward with determination. Later I learned that he was pointing toward the capital city. I made signs with my free hand to show that I wished to be set free, but was careful to do no harm to my tiny captors. Shaking his head and making signs, he let me understand that I would have to remain a prisoner, but could expect enough to eat and drink and very good treatment. With this, he and his attendants withdrew cheerfully, and others came to daub my face and hands with an ointment, very pleasant to the smell. In just a few minutes it removed all the sting of their arrows. This refreshment, added to the fine food and drink which I had received, left me feeling inclined to sleep. Indeed, I slept about 8 hours, and it is no wonder, for the Emperor had ordered a sleeping potion mingled in the wine. It seems that the Emperor, upon learning of my arrival, had quickly made plans to tie me while asleep and bring me to the capital, a bold and dangerous idea, but also wise and generous. This ruler generously supports the education of his people, who are excellent mathematicians and have achieved great skill in constructing mechanical devices. 500 carpenters and engineers had been set to work preparing a great platform a few inches above the ground, which could move on 22 wheels. The biggest problem was lifting me onto their vehicle. 80 poles were erected and strong cords fastened by hooks to bandages, which workmen wrapped around my neck, hands, body and legs. 900 of their strongest men labored to draw up these cords by means of pulleys fastened on the poles. In less than 3 hours, I was raised and slung onto their vehicle and tied fast. 1,500 of the Emperor's largest horses were required to pull their machine. All this I was later told. A ridiculous accident awakened me. While a carriage was stopped to adjust something, 2 or 3 of the young natives, out of curiosity, climbed upon me and walked up to my face. One of them stuck the end of his spear into my left nostril, which tickled my nose and made me sneeze violently. The long march continued the rest of the day, and at night we rested with 500 guards on each side of me, half with torches and half with bows and arrows. Moving again at sunrise, we arrived at the city gates about noon. The Emperor and all his court came out to meet us. It had been decided that I should lodge in an ancient temple which stood near the place where we stopped. The great gate was just large enough so that I could creep inside. 91 chains, like those which we use on a pocket watch, were locked to my left leg by means of 36 padlocks. When the workmen were certain that I could not break loose, they cut all the strings that bound me. With sadness I stood for the first time in several days. The noise and astonishment of the people as I towered above them cannot be expressed. My chains were about 2 yards long and fastened within 4 inches of the gate, so that I could walk backwards and forwards in a semicircle, or creep into my house to lie full length on the floor. The Emperor and many of his lords ascended a tower nearby for the purpose of viewing me. I am told that 100,000 citizens came out of their town to see me, and in spite of guards, many thousands climbed upon my body by means of ladders before I was allowed to stand up. When standing, I beheld an entertaining scene. The country looked like a garden, with beds of flowers ringed by stands of miniature trees. The capital city was like the painted scene of a town in a theatre. The Emperor came down from his tower and rode toward me on horseback. To the horse I must have looked like a mountain moving. Startled, it reared up on its hind legs, but His Majesty was an excellent horseman and kept his seat. He remained beyond my reach, but ordered his cooks and butlers to give me food and drink, which they pushed toward me in carts. The emperor is taller by the width of my little finger than any member of his court. His head is held high and his movements are graceful and majestic. In order to see him better, I lay on my side so that my face was at the same level as his. His sword, which he held in his hand to defend himself, was almost 3 inches long, with the handle made of gold and set with diamonds. Many times since I have held him in my hand. The ladies and gentlemen of court were all magnificently clad. The spot on the ground where they stood looked from above like a fine garment embroidered with gold and silver. When the court retired, I was left with a strong guard, as much for my protection as for theirs. The crowd pressed in as closely as they dared, and a small band of troublemakers shot some arrows, one just missing my left eye. The colonel of the guard ordered 6 of the ringleaders seized and delivered into my hand for punishment. I put 5 of them into my coat pocket and held the 6th to my face as if I were about to eat him alive. The poor man squealed terribly, and the whole crowd shrieked in fright when I took out my penknife. But soon I put the man gently on the ground and cut the strings which bound him, and away he ran. The others were taken out of my pocket one by one and treated in the same manner. I could see that both the soldiers and the people were much impressed by my punishment and act of mercy. At night I squeezed into my house and lay on the bare ground. After 2 weeks, the emperor gave orders to have a bed prepared for me. 600 beds of their common size were brought in carriages. 150 of them, sewn together, made up a size big enough for my needs, and they were stacked 4 high for my comfort. In the same way they provided blankets more than sufficient for one so used to long hardship as I. In the meantime, as I have since learned, the emperor and his council had long debates about what should be done with me. Some feared that I might break loose, and others that I would eat so much as to cause a famine in the land. There was talk of starving me to death, or of shooting me with poisoned arrows. Fortunately, the report of my treatment of the 6 criminals greatly moved His Majesty, and was much to my favour with the council. A decree was issued to have food from nearby villages delivered each morning. At the emperor's expense, 600 persons were assigned to be my domestic servants, and tents were erected for their families at each side of my door. 300 tailors were ordered to make me a suit of clothes in the fashion of the country. 6 of His Majesty's greatest scholars were employed to instruct me in their language. I made rapid progress in learning the language. The emperor often honored me with his visits and enjoyed assisting in the teaching. The first thing I learned to express was my desire for freedom, which I repeated daily on my knees. His Majesty advised me to be patient, and by my gentle behavior to earn the good opinion of himself and his subjects. His Majesty also informed me that, as required by law, he had ordered a search of my person for weapons which might be dangerous to them. Such a search could hardly have been carried out without my cooperation, and I agreed after receiving promises that anything taken would be returned when I left their country. Into my hands the emperor trusted 2 of his officials, who made an exact inventory of everything they saw. Here is their list as I later translated it into English. In the right coat pocket of the Great Man Mountain, we found 1 piece of coarse cloth, large enough to be a carpet in your Majesty's great room of state. In the left pocket was a huge silver chest with a cover which we were not able to lift. He opened it and we stepped in, finding ourselves up to our knees in some sort of dust, which set us both to sneezing. In the right waistcoat pocket we found a bundle of thin white sheets, as long as 3 men, marked with black figures, folded one over the other and tied with strong cable. In the left pocket was a device from which extended 20 long poles. We think it likely that the Man Mountain uses this to comb his hair. In the large pocket on the right side of his breeches, we saw a hollow pillar of iron about the length of a man, fastened at an angle to a great block of wood. On one side of the pillar, huge pieces of iron stuck out in strange figures. We do not know what to make of this. In the left pocket was another device of the same kind. In the smaller pocket on the right side were several round, flat pieces of metal of different sizes and colours. Some seemed to be of silver, but were so large and heavy that the two of us could hardly lift them. In the left pocket were two black pillars nearly higher than we could reach. Within each was a huge plate of steel. He told us that his practice was to shave his beard with one of these and to cut his meat with the other. We were unable to enter the two slits in the top of his breeches, which are squeezed tight by his belly. These he calls fobs, and from one hung a great silver chain attached to some kind of wonderful machine. It is round and silver on one side, but of some transparent material on the other. On the transparent side, figures are drawn in a circle, but the material prevented us from touching them. The machine makes a constant clanking noise. From the left fob he removed a net large enough for catching fish, which opens and shuts like a purse. In it we found several huge pieces of yellow metal which, if they be real gold, must be of immense value. Finally, he wears a belt about his waist, made of the hide of some great animal. On the left side hung a sword the length of 5 men, and on the right a bag divided into 2 parts, each large enough to hold 3 of your Majesty's subjects. In one part were balls of shiny metal about the size of our heads. In the other was a heap of black grains, small enough that we could hold 50 in the palms of our hands. When the Emperor had read the inventory, he directed me to display these items. As 3,000 of his troops surrounded me with bows and arrows, I drew my sword and waved it over my head. The reflections of sunlight dazzled the eyes of the troops, who shouted in terror. His Majesty calmly ordered me to cast the sword as gently as possible on the ground beyond the end of my chain. Next he wished to see one of the hollow iron pillars, meaning my pocket pistols. Placing powder but no bullets in it, I fired into the air. This time even His Majesty was shaken, but firmly directed me to give up both pistols and the pouch of powder and bullets in the same manner as the sword. I begged him to keep these objects from any fire, since the smallest spark could blow the imperial palace into the air. The Emperor was very curious to see my watch, and commanded 2 of his tallest yeomen to bear it on a pole upon their shoulders. Amazed at the continual noise and the motion of the minute hand, he sought the opinions of his learned men about what it could be. In turn I displayed my silver and copper coins, my purse with 9 large pieces of gold, my knife and razor, my comb and silver snuff-box, my journal book and handkerchief. All these items were returned to me. I did not reveal to them, however, a private pocket, which held a pair of spectacles, a small spyglass, and several little conveniences of no danger to the Emperor. These I did not wish to take the risk of losing. My gentleness and good behaviour were making such an impression upon the Emperor and his court, and indeed upon the people in general, that I began to have hope of soon receiving my freedom. I did everything possible to encourage their trust, and little by little they began to lose all fear. Sometimes I would lie down and let 5 or 6 of them dance on my hand, or the boys and girls play hide-and-seek in my hair. One day the Emperor decided to entertain me with the kind of variety show in which they excel. Most especially I was amazed by the dancers who perform upon slender white threads nearly 3 feet from the ground. Rope dancers are trained from youth. Those who can jump the highest without falling are rewarded with favours or high office at court. Often the chief ministers themselves are commanded to show their skill and convince the Emperor that they have not lost their abilities. I have personally seen Flimnap, the Lord High Treasurer, do somersaults on the slender cord. The horses of the army and those of the royal stables were daily led before me until they were no longer shy about coming up to my feet. The riders would have the horses leap over my hand, and once one of the Emperor's huntsmen on a spirited steed leapt over my foot, shoe and all, a truly impressive deed. One day, while I was entertaining the court, a messenger arrived to inform His Majesty that some of his subjects had seen a great black object near the place where I had been discovered. It was round, as big as His Majesty's bedchamber, and very oddly shaped, rising in the middle as high as a man. By climbing upon each other's shoulders they had found it to be flat on top, and by stamping upon it had found it to be hollow within. They believed it must belong to the Man Mountain. I was glad to receive the news, for I knew at once what the object was. It seems that upon reaching shore, after our shipwreck, I had lost my hat. It was fastened to my head by a string, and I had supposed it lost at sea. It must have remained on my head all the time I was swimming, the string breaking only after I reached land. I explained the use of the object to His Majesty and humbly asked to have it brought to me. The next day wagoners arrived with it, but not in very good condition. They had bored 2 holes in the brim and fastened hooks in the holes. The hooks were tied by cords to the harnesses of their horses, and thus my hat was dragged along for more than half a mile. 2 days later the Emperor took pleasure in creating a most unusual spectacle. He wished me to stand like a colossus, with my legs as far apart as possible. Then he commanded his generals to have the royal army march under me. More than 4,000 soldiers, 24 abreast on foot or 16 abreast on horseback, paraded between my legs with drums beating, colours flying and spears advanced. Soon thereafter His Majesty brought up in his council the matter of my many requests for liberty. The only member opposed was Skyresh Bolgoland, Admiral of the Realm, a person of sour disposition who, for no cause that I had given him, chose to remain my enemy. He held out for the right to draw up the list of articles and conditions upon which I was to be set free. After these were read to me, I was required to swear to abide by them, first in the manner of my own country, and then in the manner described in their laws. Their method of giving an oath required that I hold my right foot in my left hand and place the middle finger of my right hand on the top of my head, with the thumb on the tip of my right ear. Here is a translation of the document. Golbast Mamaran Mulialigu, most mighty Emperor of Liliput, delight and terror of the universe, whose kingdom extends 5,000 blustrugs, about 12 miles, to the ends of the earth, King of kings, at whose nod the princes of the earth shake their knees, pleasant as the spring, comfortable as the summer, fruitful as autumn, dreadful as winter, desires that the Man Mountain solemnly swear to the following. First, he shall not depart our kingdom without our permission. Second, he shall not come into our great city without royal permission, and then only after all residents are given 2 hours' warning to keep within their doors. Third, he shall walk only on our principal roads, not walking or lying down in our meadows or fields of corn. Fourth, as he walks he shall take utmost care not to trample upon any of our loving subjects, their horses or carriages, nor shall he take any of our subjects into his hands without permission. Fifth, he shall be our ally against enemies in Blefuscu, and do his utmost to destroy their fleet. Sixth, he shall from time to time aid and assist our workmen in raising great stones to the top of walls surrounding our royal parks and buildings. Lastly, upon his solemn oath to observe all these articles, the said Man Mountain shall receive a daily allowance of meat and drink equal to the needs of 1,728 of our subjects. I agreed and swore to these articles. Immediately my chains were unlocked and I was set free. The Emperor himself did me the honor of being present at this ceremony, and I showed my allegiance by lying on the ground at his royal feet. The reader may wonder why the last article promised an allowance of food and drink equal to that of 1,728 Lilliputians. I was informed that His Majesty's mathematicians had calculated the height of my body to exceed theirs by 12 times, and concluded that my body could contain at least 1,728 Lilliputians. Therefore, they reasoned, I must require that much more food. This is an example of the wisdom of the Emperor and the cleverness of his people. The wall surrounding the capital city is 2.5 feet high, and nearly a foot wide, with strong towers every 10 feet. The city is an exact square, each side of the wall being 500 feet long. The 2 great streets which divide it into 4 quarters are 5 feet wide. The width of lanes and alleys is from 1 to 1.5 feet. Many buildings are from 3 to 5 stories high. Shops and markets are plentiful. When I visited the city, a proclamation was issued for all the people to remain inside their houses. I stepped over the western gate and walked gently down one of the principal streets, stepping carefully to avoid treading upon any stragglers. The Emperor's palace is in the center of the city, where the two great streets meet, and is surrounded by another wall 2 feet high. His Majesty desired that I should see the magnificence of his palace and royal apartments, but it was difficult to devise a way of doing so without damaging any of the walls and buildings. Very carefully, I made my way into the inner courtyard, and, lying down upon my side, peered into open windows. There I saw the Empress and the youthful royalty with their attendants in the most splendid apartments that can be imagined. Her Majesty was pleased to smile very graciously and give her hand out the window for me to kiss. One morning soon after, I was visited by Reldresal, whose title was Principal Secretary of Private Affairs. He told me that, although conditions within the empire might appear orderly and happy, His Majesty faced great dangers. For one thing, there were 2 parties within the kingdom who were so angry with one another that they would neither eat nor drink together, and often refused to speak. Members of one party wore high heels on their shoes, and their opponents marked their differences by wearing low heels. The Emperor much favoured the low-heel party, all officers of court being of that group, and His Majesty's heels being the lowest of all. The high-heelers were greater in number, but the low-heelers had much greater power. Besides this problem, the country was threatened by invasion from Blefuscu, the other great empire of the universe. He much doubted that there were other kingdoms and states inhabited by humans as large as myself, as I had stated. Their wise men argued that 100 mortals of my size would quickly destroy all the fruits and cattle of the land, and therefore I must have dropped from the moon or one of the stars. Liliput and Blefuscu had been at war for 36 moons, over the question of the way to break eggs before eating them. In times long ago, people had always broken their eggs on the larger ends, but His Majesty's grandfather, while a boy, happened to cut one of his fingers while breaking an egg in the ancient way. The Emperor, his father, then issued an edict commanding all subjects under penalty of law to break their eggs on the smaller end. The people so resented this law that 6 rebellions followed. In time, thousands of persons lost their lives rather than submit to breaking the smaller ends of their eggs. As a result, many big Indians had fled to Blefuscu, where the Emperor of that country was more than ready to take advantage of the situation. A bloody war had been carried on, countless ships and many thousand soldiers and seamen on both sides being lost. Now, the secretary told me, Blefuscu had equipped a great fleet which was preparing to attack Liliput. His Imperial Majesty was placing great confidence in my valor and sense of duty. I told the secretary that I was ready, even at the risk of my life, to defend His Majesty's person and empire against all invaders. The Empire of Blefuscu is an island north-northeast of Liliput across a channel 800 yards wide. The most experienced seaman told me that at high water, the middle of the channel was 70 glumgluffs deep, about 6 feet, and the rest of it 50 glumgluffs at most. Lying down behind a small hill so as not to be seen, I took out the small spyglass from my private pocket to have a look. The enemy fleet consisted of about 50 men of war plus many other ships, all at anchor and ready to sail. The people of Blefuscu knew nothing of me, so I could easily take them by surprise. I formed a plan. I asked the Emperor to supply me with a great quantity of the strongest cable and iron bars. The cable had the thickness of string and the bars the size of knitting needles. To make them stronger, I twisted 3 of the cables together. I also twisted 3 of the iron bars, bending the ends to form hooks. After fixing 50 hooks to 50 cables and removing my coat, shoes and stockings, I waded into the sea. Only half an hour of walking and swimming were needed to reach the enemy fleet. The people were so frightened when they saw me that they jumped from their ships and swam to the shore. Placing a hook through a hole at the prow of each ship, I tied all the cords together at the other end. While I was doing this, the enemy shot several thousand arrows, many striking me in the hands and face, causing a good deal of pain. Fearful for my eyes, I removed from my private pocket the pair of spectacles and fastened them strongly upon my nose. Now, as I continued my work, many arrows did strike the glass, but my eyes were safe. I took the knotted cord in my hand and began to pull, but not a ship would stir, because all were held fast by their anchors. Boldly wading among the fleet, I cut the anchor cables with my knife, receiving more than 200 shots in my face and hands. Then it was easy to tow all 50 of the enemy's men-of-war out into the channel. When the Blefuscarians saw their whole fleet moving as one away from their shore, they sent up an awful scream. When out of danger, I picked out the arrows from my hands and face and rubbed on some of the Lilliputians' soothing ointment. The Emperor and his whole court were standing on the shore, and saw the ships moving toward them like a great half-moon. Because I was up to my neck in water, they could not see me, and greatly feared that I had drowned, and that the enemy's fleet was nearing for an attack. But as I rose from the water, I lifted up the ends of the cables and cried in a loud voice, "Long live the powerful Emperor of Liliput!" His gracious Majesty greeted me with all possible praise, and on the spot conferred upon me the Order of Nardak, the highest title of honor among them. The ambition of kings is unending, however. Soon the Emperor wanted me to bring all the rest of Blefusco's ships to his ports, destroy all the big Indians, and make him Emperor of the whole world. I made excuses because I did not want to bring a free and brave people into slavery. There were those in council who agreed with me, but His Majesty never forgave me. This was the beginning of my loss of favor at the royal court. 6 weeks later, there arrived from Blefuscu ambassadors with a humble offer of peace. When a treaty had been signed, very favorable to our emperor, their excellencies from Blefuscu paid me a visit. Although I had stolen their fleet, they thanked me for later being their friend at the court of Lilliput, and invited me in the name of their emperor to visit his kingdom. When next I saw our emperor, I requested permission to call upon the ruler of Blefuscu. In a very cold manner he agreed, but he never sent the official papers saying that I could leave the island. Later I learned that Flimnap and Bolgolam had told him of my meeting with the ambassadors, saying it showed that I could no longer be trusted. In my heart I knew that I was free from any thoughts disloyal to our emperor. One night, around midnight, I was awakened by urgent cries for help. The apartments of Her Imperial Majesty the Empress were on fire. Orders were given to clear the way before me as I attempted to get quickly to the palace without stepping on anyone. Ladders had been placed against the palace walls, and buckets of water were being passed from one person to another and thrown on the fire. But the buckets were only about the size of large thimbles, and the best efforts of the people had little chance against the violent flames. The situation seemed desperate. The magnificent palace would surely burn to the ground. I did the only thing I could think to do. By chance I had that evening drunk a great deal of a most delicious wine, and it was still all within me. I was able to relieve myself in such quantity and applied so well to the proper places that in 3 minutes the fire was completely put out. I returned home without speaking to the Emperor because, although I had done him a great service, yet I was not sure how His Majesty might feel about the way in which I had performed it. It was in fact a capital crime for anyone to relieve himself in the vicinity of the palace. The Emperor did send word that he was recommending my pardon to the High Court, but the Empress, I was informed, was enraged by what I had done, and had moved to the far side of the palace, vowing revenge. The reader is probably curious to know many things about the Lilliputian people. Their common size is somewhat under 6 inches high, and all other plants and animals are in proportion. The tallest horses are between 4 and 5 inches in height, the tallest trees about 7 feet. Although the smallest birds are all but invisible to me, nature has adapted the eyes of the Lilliputians to see such things clearly. I have watched young girls thread invisible needles with invisible silk. They are not, however, able to see for great distances. In order to live comfortably in this country, I made for myself a table and chair out of the largest trees in the royal forest. 200 seamstresses made my shirts and linen for my bed and table, all of the strongest and coarsest material they could get. With the help of my old shirt placed on the ground for a pattern, they pieced material together and fitted me exactly. 300 tailors made my clothes. As I knelt down, they raised a ladder to my neck and dropped a plumb line from my collar to the floor, thus measuring the length for my coat. My waist and arms I measured myself. The construction of coat and trousers had to be completed in my house, since the largest of theirs would not have been able to hold an entire garment. 300 cooks prepared my meals in convenient little huts built around my house where their families also lived. I would take 20 waiters in my hand and place them on the table, while 100 more worked below, some with dishes of meat and some with barrels of wine slung upon their shoulders. The waiters above cleverly lifted the food to me by means of cords and pulleys in the way by which we draw water from a well. A dish of their meat was a good mouthful, and a barrel of their liquor a reasonable swallow. One day, His Imperial Majesty, along with the Empress and the royal family, came to dinner. I placed their chairs of state upon my table with their guards about them. Also attending was Flimnap, the Lord High Treasurer, with his white staff. I have reason to believe that this occasion gave him the chance to complain to the Emperor that providing me with so much food was seriously depleting the royal treasury. Always a person of sour disposition, Flimnap had nevertheless been quite friendly toward me. Inwardly, however, he had been my secret enemy. The treasurer also became jealous because his wife came from time to my house to visit. Never did her grace come alone, but always in a coach with at least 3 other women. It was my custom on such occasions to take up the coach with 2 of the horses and place them on my table, to which I had fixed a rim 5 inches high in order to prevent accidents. Often I had 4 coaches and horses at once on my table. I would sit in my chair, leaning my face towards them as we passed the afternoon pleasantly in conversation. Flimnap treated his wife badly for some time, but eventually did make up with her. Yet I found my favor at court declining because of his influence with the emperor. I remained popular with the people, however. Fortunately, I had the honor to be a Nardak, while all the kingdom knew that the treasurer himself was only a Clumglum. Because of the status of my birth, I had been a stranger at royal courts until I came to Liliput. Indeed, I had heard and read enough of great princes and ministers, but never expected to find myself in a place where their thoughts and actions had such direct effect upon my life. Late one night, a person of noble title at court came secretly to my house. One time, when he had experienced His Majesty's displeasure, I had been very helpful to him. Now he wished to tell me news of high concern to my honor and my life. He informed me that the council had recently been having secret meetings and making decisions about my fate. Skyresh Bolgalan, the Lord High Admiral, had for unknown reasons been my enemy since my arrival. Now it seems he hated me even more because my success against Blefuscu's fleet had dimmed his glory as admiral. He had joined with Flimnap and several other lords of court to prepare charges of treason against me. My visitor presented me with a copy of the charges, which mentioned all of the following and more. I had relieved myself of urine within the bounds of the royal palace. I had refused His Majesty's wish that I destroy all the fleet of Blefuscu, put that country under the rule of our emperor, and put to death all big Indians. I had given aid and comfort to the ambassadors from Blefuscu, knowing that they had recently been open enemies of His Imperial Majesty. I was preparing to make a visit to the court of Blefuscu after receiving only verbal permission from His Majesty, and intended to give aid to another emperor who had recently been at war with Liliput. The treasurer and admiral insisted, I was told, that I be put to death by setting fire to my house at night, while the general stood by with 20,000 men armed with poisoned arrows. Reldrasal, the principal secretary for private affairs, suggested that, since mercy was the mark of a great ruler, he should simply put out my eyes. He proposed that even without them my strength could be of great use to His Majesty. This made the Admiral furious. He argued that my strength could be a great danger to the Empire if my loyalties should turn elsewhere, and that he had good reason to believe I was a big Indian at heart. The Treasurer added that putting out my eyes would not solve the problem of the high cost to the Royal Treasury of feeding me. His Lordship informed me that His Majesty believed that some leniency was in order because of the services which I had done him. He was determined not to use capital punishment, seeking some other course. The Secretary had the idea of reducing my rations of food, which would reduce the burden upon the Royal Treasury and, in time, cause me to grow weak and faint. Since the size and weight of my body would be reduced, he stated, only 5,000 or 6,000 of His Majesty's subjects would be needed after my death to cut the flesh from my bones and bury it safely in a distant place. That would leave my skeleton as a monument of admiration for future generations. This is how the whole affair was compromised. It was agreed that the project of starving me by degrees be kept secret, but the sentence of putting out my eyes made official. Still, the Admiral, much influenced by the Empress, continued to argue for my death. His Lordship, my visitor, told me that in 3 days the Secretary would come to my house and read the charges against me. He would inform me of the great leniency of His Majesty and the Council in condemning me only to the loss of my eyes. The Emperor was sure that I would gratefully submit to having 20 of His Majesty's surgeons discharge sharp arrows into my eyes as I lay on the ground. I must confess that, not having been prepared by education or birth for life at court, I was not able to understand how His Majesty's sentence upon me was either lenient or merciful. It seemed to me much more cruel than gentle. As long as I was free, the whole strength of the Empire could hardly subdue me. I might easily pelt the whole capital city to pieces with stones. But although I had decided to resist, I soon rejected such destructive ideas, remembering my oath to the Emperor and his favours to me. Instead, I resolved to leave the island before the 3 days were over. His Majesty had given me permission to visit Blefuscu, even though it was not made official. I sent a letter to the Secretary announcing my intention to set out for Blefuscu. Not waiting for an answer, I went to the place where the fleet lay and seized a large man-of-war. Tying a cable to the prow and lifting up the anchors, I put my clothes and a blanket into the vessel. Wading and swimming, I drew the boat behind me until I arrived at the royal port of Blefuscu. The people had been expecting me and quickly provided 2 guides to direct me to the capital city. I held them in my hands until we came within 200 yards of the city gates. The guides announced my arrival. After about an hour, His Majesty, attended by the royal family and great officers of the court, came out to receive me. The Emperor and his retinue alighted from their horses, the Empress and ladies from their coaches, showing no signs of fear. Lying on the ground, I kissed His Majesty's and the Empress's hand. I told His Majesty that I had come, according to my promise, and with the permission of my Emperor, to have the honour of seeing so mighty a ruler and to offer him service. I said nothing of my disgrace in Liliput, since no official word of it had been given to me, and it would be supposed that I myself knew nothing of it. My reception at the court of Blefuscu was suitable to the generosity of so great an emperor. Unfortunately, they had no house or bed large enough for my needs. I was forced to lie on the ground at night, wrapped only in my blanket. 3 days after my arrival, I was walking near the northeast coast, where I noticed something that looked like an overturned boat drifting upon the sea. Taking off my shoes and wading 200 or 300 yards, I could plainly see that it was a real boat, perhaps lost from a ship during some storm. Returning to the city, I asked His Majesty to lend me 20 of his tallest ships and 3,000 seamen under the command of his Vice-Admiral. While this fleet sailed around the island, I went back the shortest way to the place where I had seen the boat. The tide had driven it still nearer to shore. When the fleet appeared, I waded until within 100 yards of the boat, after which it was necessary to swim. To the forepart of the boat I fastened cord which I had twisted to a sufficient strength. The other end of the cord was secured to a man-of-war. Because I was over my head in water, I had to swim behind and push the boat from time to time with one hand. The tide still favoured me, and I was able to advance the boat to the point where I could touch bottom. After resting 2 or 3 minutes, I gave the boat another shove, rested, and shoved again. Now the hard work was done. I fastened cables, which were stowed in the other sailing ships, to the boat. The seamen towed, I shoved, the wind was favourable, and soon we arrived at shore. 2,000 men with ropes, levers, and other devices assisted until we had towed the boat onto dry land and turned it upright. We found it but little damaged. 10 days of work were needed to make paddles and get my boat to the royal port. A mighty crowd of people appeared upon my arrival, full of wonder at the sight of so huge a vessel. His Majesty kindly granted my request for help in repairing my boat and fitting it for the sea. It was surprising that nothing had been heard from the Emperor of Liliput. Believing that I had no knowledge of the sentence which had been passed against me, His Majesty and the council thought that I would soon return. But when they became concerned about my long absence, an official was dispatched with a copy of the charges against me. He was instructed to tell the Emperor of Blefuscu how generous his master had been in punishing me only with the loss of my eyes, and that if I did not return at once, I would be declared a traitor. He added that in order to maintain the peace between the two empires, I should be sent back to Lilliput bound hand and foot. The Emperor of Blefuscu, however, took 3 days to consult with his ministers before making polite excuses. He said that sending me bound was quite impossible because he owed me much for my great help in making peace, adding that both their majesties would find comfort in the fact that I had found a vessel able to carry me on the sea. He expressed his hope that in a few weeks both empires would be freed from the burden of supporting me. In private, His Majesty offered me his gracious protection if I would continue in his service. Although I believed him sincere, I had resolved never again to put my trust in royalty and their ministers if I could possibly avoid it. Thanking him for his kind offer, I begged to be excused, saying that, for good or evil, I preferred to venture onto the ocean rather than continue to be a cause of conflict between two such mighty emperors. I think that His Majesty was not at all displeased, and in fact that he and his ministers were quite relieved. It seemed well to depart as quickly as possible. 500 workmen were employed to make 2 sails by quilting together 13 bolts of their strongest linen. I made ropes and cables by twisting together 10, 20, or 30 of the thickest and strongest of theirs. A great stone served me for an anchor, and the tallow of 300 cows sealed my boat. His Majesty's ship carpenters assisted by smoothing the oars and masts after I had done the rough work. After about a month, all was prepared. When I was ready to take my leave, the Emperor and royal family came out of the palace. I lay down on my face to kiss his hand, which he graciously gave me, and so did the Empress and the young princes and princesses. His Majesty presented me with 50 purses, each with 200 coins, and a full-length picture of himself. In the boat I stored as much meat, bread, and drink as 400 cooks could provide. I took 6 cows and 2 bulls alive and as many ewes and rams, hoping to carry them to my own country and reproduce the tiny breeds. To feed them on board I had a good bundle of hay and a bag of corn. I would gladly have taken a dozen of the natives with me, but that was one thing the Emperor would by no means permit. Having prepared all things as well as I could, I set sail in the month of September. Late in the day I spied a small island, sailed toward it and cast anchor on the lee side. The island seemed uninhabited. I took refreshment and slept well. The day broke clear, and heaving anchor I steered the same course as the day before, directed by my pocket compass. My hope was to reach one of certain islands which I had reason to believe lay in that direction. I discovered nothing at all that day, but upon the next, about 3 in the afternoon, spied a sail to the southeast. Unable to attract her attention, I pursued at full sail for half an hour and hailed again. This time she hung out her flag and discharged a gun. My heart leaped with joy upon seeing her English colours. It is impossible to express my happiness at the thought of once more seeing my beloved country. I put my cows and sheep into my coat pockets and got on board with my little cargo. About 50 men were on board the ship, which was under the command of Mr. John Biddle, a very civil man and excellent sailor. He desired to know from what place I had come, but upon hearing my story, quickly concluded that I was raving mad from being too long adrift at sea. The black cattle and sheep from my pocket caused great amazement and convinced him that I was speaking the truth. Then I showed him the picture given me by the Emperor of Blefuscu, and presented him with 2 of the tiny purses of gold, promising more when we reached England. Our voyage was safe and prosperous for the most part. There was but one misfortune. The rats on board carried away one of my sheep. We arrived in England on the 13th of April, 1702. The cattle were set to grazing on a bowling green where the fine grass fed them well. I was able to make a profit by showing them to persons of wealth, and eventually sold them for a considerable sum. Recently I have learned that the breed has continued to increase in numbers, which I hope proves well for the manufacture of fine woolens. But by this time my desire to see far countries and learn the ways of their peoples had become impossible to resist. Soon I began to long for the sea and boarded the Adventure, a merchant ship bound for Surat. But that is another story.